I'm Michael Aron of NJN News. It's the afternoon of April 5th, 2006. We're going to talk to Dick Leone, who was a key architect of the early Byrne administration, the first campaign. He was state treasurer during the first Byrne term, and he ran the re-election campaign. And we're doing this for the Rutgers Oral History Project on the New Jersey governors. Dick Leone is one of the key names in New Jersey politics over the past 35 years. He's closely identified with the Brendan Byrne administration, but he has reemerged on the scene after Governor Corzine's election. He ran Corzine's transition team, and Corzine can't seem to let go of him because Corzine just named him to chair a task force on re-engineering government. During that time, he's advised other governors. He ran for the U.S. Senate, and from what I just learned before we started taping, he knows some governors who served prior to Brendan Byrne, going back as far as whom? Bob Minor?
Bob Minor, although I knew him after he was governor.
Let me start by asking you to give us a sense in 2006 of what the New Jersey governorship actually was in 1973 when you and Brendan Byrne and a handful of others walked into the State House.
Well, let me go back a little bit further, because Brendan was Bob Minor's secretary, which at that time was a chief staff job. And I was administrative assistant to Governor Hughes, Minor's successor. So we both came to office with fairly recent experience in the governor's office and with pretty highly developed ideas about how it ought to run. It turns out, of course, there are very good reasons why it doesn't run like a smooth, well-oiled machine, but you have to find that out for yourself when you finally get the authority to do that. New Jersey was an old-fashioned state. People forget that in the 60s and early 70s. It was 50th in per capita support for education at the state level. It was 50th in the percentage of students who went to college in state. It was the last state to join the food stamp program, the last state to join Medicaid, the last state to have a community college. It was a very localistic, old-fashioned, Rust Belt state, and it underwent a revolution starting in the late 60s and through the 70s and 80s to become now about the richest state in the country and one of the most modern. I think the governors that we've had over that period often played a great role in that development, some for good, some for ill. Byrne came at a time when there was a crisis about what the state government would be. We were the last state in the Northeast to get a broad-based tax. Remember, New Jersey didn't have a sales or an income tax until 1966. And Hughes tried to get an income tax and failed. And then Cahill tried to get an income tax and failed. And then it was Byrne's turn. A little bit like second lieutenants in World War I. They'd go up and be mowed down, and the next one would go up and be mowed down.
Hughes did get a sales tax?
Hughes got a sales tax as a fallback.
Do you recall what the percentage was when he got it?
I can recall more than that. I was there. First of all, we did, in fact, pass the income tax through the lower house. It was exact parallel with Byrne. And then on the morning of the day it was supposed to be voted in without any trouble in the Senate, the head of the delegation from Essex County, which is an exaggeration, the man who could remember Harry Lerner's instructions long enough to get down to Trenton, walked into the State House and said, "I don't think there are going to be any Essex votes for this income tax."
Harry Lerner was the Essex County boss, Democratic boss.
Yes, he was. Turned out to be very important in Byrne's story, but I'll get to that later.
Today, it's a shibboleth, it's an accepted fact, or bit of conventional wisdom, that the New Jersey governor is the most powerful governor in the land. Were you all saying such a thing back in the early 70s?
As somewhat of a student of this, that's technically true, and it never seems that way to the governor. I mean, what you're mostly conscious of is how difficult it is to get anything done. I think one of the things the structure in New Jersey means is that the New Jersey governor has a broader agenda, because he or she's the only statewide elected official, and they control things like the Attorney General and other departments, education, which often are independent. The governor has a lot on his or her plate, And so they have a very extensive agenda. They have a lot of potential political influence because they can appoint prosecutors and judges, and people who, again, are elected in many states. Assembling all that power and using it effectively occasionally can lead to major breakthroughs. But New Jersey had been a very localistic state run by county organizations politically who dominated the legislature. And the governor had to deal with those power brokers more on a basis of equality than of dominance. There was a period, I think, of reform when that faded away, and Byrne was a big part of that. But it has reemerged in current times in a somewhat different coloration. In the old days, it was because people could deliver the vote, and there were legions of disciplined voters who would vote for the donkey or vote for the elephant. Today, money is so important. It's so dominant in politics that people with the ability to raise a lot of money, and how they do that is a sorry story in my view generally in the state, have a lot of influence in politics. I don't mean wealthy people who've always been able to have disproportionate influence. I mean people in politics who use the powers of government to grant licenses, permits, generate all kinds of business, to develop a base of fundraising which supports legislators and in turn gives them influence. And the governor has to confront that problem in both parties. On the other hand, because New Jersey has limited electronic media, the governor is the only person who can be heard most of the time, and that can sometimes influence the debate by making it seem like supporting the governor is a wise thing to do politically. I think we should just mention, as we sit here in 2006, we've had a kind of free-range legislature for the last several years where there's not been a strong gubernatorial hand, and so today's situation is much more akin, in my judgment, to what I saw in the 60s and 70s than what existed in between.
You see individual legislators as having fiefdoms of a sort?
I think they take for granted that they'll be able to control sections of the budget, policy activities in certain areas, a bargain with the governor. I mean, I was shocked during the transition to hear Treasury officials outlining what was in the budget, past budgets, and you'd say, well, why is that in there if it's not funded? And they'd say, well, the legislature put it in. Well, Brendan Byrne would have said, well, I'll take it out. You have a line item veto. Brendan used to not only line items that weren't funded, he would change the numbers sometimes so that it was appropriate. One of my favorite stories about Brendan is when somebody came in and said, I hope you didn't do this because, it was on the phone actually, I hope you didn't do this because I was critical of the governor, that was just politics. And Brendan said, no, I didn't. Actually, this is just politics. And he hung up the phone. You can use the power if you want to.
You say you were an administrative assistant to Hughes. Were you a student at the time?
I actually got hired into that office while I was still in graduate school. At Princeton. I had no intention of staying in New Jersey. I wanted to go into international affairs. And
where did you go to undergraduate?
Rochester, University of Rochester. I'm from upstate New York.
And then you went to the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. What year?
I went there in 63.
63. And while you were in graduate school, you went to work for the New Jersey governor? How did that come about?
In March of 65, the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School then, Marva Bernstein, as he subsequently related to me, decided that I was my actual aptitude was for this sort of thing, which was not my plan. My plan was to go into the Foreign Service. And he steered me to a guy named Joe Katz, who was the dominant member of the Hughes office. I decided to go to Trenton. I'd never met a governor. I'd never been in a governor's office or a state house before. And I came in and they asked me to write a couple of things. And Joe said, come on with me. And we went down the hall and we met the governor. And he said, look, he wrote this stuff.
Katz was an old newspaper man. Was he communications director or did he have a broader portfolio?
He was a top staff person. The governor's, Hughes's staff was, 8 or 10 of us used to sit around and argue with the governor. It was a very level organizational table and very different from what most governors would tolerate. But Hughes was a remarkably secure and brilliant man in his own way. And he enjoyed the give and take.
So Joe Katz said to the governor, this guy can write, let's make use of him?
Yeah, so they hired me, and I became quickly important because I was given an obscure issue to handle. A Rutgers professor named Eugene Genovese at an anti-Vietnam teach-in said, and these are the key words which I'll never forget, unlike others here, I do not fear or regret the impending Viet Cong victory in Vietnam. I welcome it. That set off a firestorm and became an irresistible magnet for the attention of the Republican candidate for governor. This was an election year, 1965, Wayne Dumont. Pretty good guy, but he was lured by the siren call of this issue. They gave it to me to handle because I was just still in school. This happened in April. And no one knew it would become the most important issue in the campaign. It became the only issue in the campaign. And my stock kind of rose with it, and I was given responsibility for the new programs for the second term.
How did Hughes, the Democrat, handle this?
Hughes was a supporter of Johnson in the war, but he believed in academic freedom and free speech, and he said no, he wouldn't. He demanded he be fired. And that became the issue.
And the people of this backwater state you described earlier believed in free speech as well, and so reelected him?
He was won by what was then the largest margin in history. He went on to put in a gun control law that's still in place. You have to get a license from your local police chief to buy a gun of any kind, including a long gun. He got through the first broad-based tax. He set up the community colleges. He revolutionized higher education by, at that time, New Jersey had 6 state colleges. They were just normal schools, each one headed by a former principal. And Hughes broke that open and created the Department of Higher Education. He did a lot. His portrait, by the way, is about, even as we speak, about to move out of the governor's office to one of those obscure places in the Dome. And for me, it's a poignant moment.
Because the room has to be made for McGreevy's portrait?
McGreevy and Cody, and it's getting cluttered.
What was Hughes like as a manager?
Hughes was like FDR as a manager. He often gave more than one person the same job. He relished conflict. He would, as I said, 8 or 10 of us would yell at him, and then he'd make his own mind up, sometimes going with one. He used his staff very effectively. I have to tell you one anecdote. I know we're going to talk about Byrne, but couldn't have been more than a month after I was in the office. They asked me to look at Penn Central and its finances because they claimed to be in trouble. And the president of Penn Central was coming to meet with the governor, Stuart Saunders, and his lawyer.
That's a railroad for anybody young who doesn't remember. Go ahead.
The old Pennsylvania Railroad and the old New York Central Railroad were together. And he had Bob Miner, the former governor, as his lawyer, Stuart Sanders. So we have a meeting with Governor Hughes, Bob Miner, and Stuart Sanders, and this kid from Princeton, right? And we're going along, and Hughes says, well, I don't know, Bob. Looking at this memo here that Richard just wrote, and he says I ought to let you go bankrupt if that's what it takes to clean up this inefficient company. That was Hughes. I've never known anybody else who would do anything like that.
How did that make you feel at that moment?
At that moment, I was quite uncomfortable. Later on, it made me feel good. He was a great fellow. And he became a key player in Byrne's life because he became the Chief Justice who forced the income tax issue and the school tax issue.
What was Hughes like as a speaker?
He was a great speaker. Hughes was kind of the best of a dying breed at that time, the old-fashioned Irish-American politician who was lovable, could have business walk out and say he's a great guy, and labor walk out and say he was a great guy, but with a sharp, legalistic mind. Very funny. He could take your best speech and turn it into a better speech. He could pull off, the things that other people couldn't. And the debates with Dumont were not a fair fight. Hughes would have the audience laughing and, saying things like, well, now I'm going to sit down, and when I do, I hope the real Wayne Dumont will stand up. Poor Wayne would get up, and people would start laughing, and he'd sit back down, and then they'd break into applause. And it was great.
What was he like as a boss?
Well, for me, he was wonderful.
How so?
because he let you do as much as you could do, regardless of what stage you were at.
How old were you when you went to work?
24.
24. What was he like as a politician?
Hughes had to balance a machine that was corrupt. And I think I'd put it this way. Hughes was determined that he would remain clean. And I think everybody sees him that way. He was not determined to change the system. Brendan was determined to change the system. That was the next generation of Irish-American politicians in New Jersey. I think Hughes would have if he'd come along a little later. But he had been a judge. He'd come up through the political system. I think he did as much as he thought he could. At that time, the bosses seemed unassailable.
Who were the bosses?
Well, there were John V. Kenney in Hudson County, who was the direct successor of Frank Hague. Actually, the first thing Hughes sat me down and tell me about, I want you to tell you about these guys. I call them the bad boys. They're all SOBs. That's all you really have to know about New Jersey politics. Here's who they are. Harry Lerner, Dennis Carey at that time in Essex County. David Wilentz, who's kind of in a different category. But, you know.
What category was David Wilentz in?
David Wilentz was the Attorney General who prosecuted the Lindbergh kidnapping trial. He was the Democratic National Committee man during the decades when each state only had one. He was the man at the 1944 Democratic Convention who made the speech against Roosevelt's renomination because Roosevelt had fallen out with Frank Hague. He was a brilliant guy who had a brilliant son. He once said to me during the Reform era in the 70s, he said, well, how did we do? I don't know. We backed Roosevelt, we backed Truman, backed Stevenson, backed Kennedy. Now you got this guy McGovern. What did we know? He was that kind of guy. He was a wonderful guy.
Any other bosses besides the
There
Hudson,
were others,
Essex, and
there
Middlesex?
were others that had, but, I mean, there were people, but not at the same level.
In that day and at that time, were politics ethnic in the state?
Well, they were very ethnic, and that was new to me because I came from a small, when I grew up, farming community where everybody was kind of level community. There wasn't a lot of income stratification, and there wasn't any particular ethnic identification.
What's your ethnic background?
Italian, and that, of course, in New Jersey I was probably hired on that basis for all I know at that time. But politics were pretty ethnic.
Were the Irish dominant?
The Irish were still dominant. Although they hadn't, from their point of view, they hadn't been for very long. I mean, New Jersey had a long history of Republican governors and of sort of older American stock, with the Irish occupying lower levels, not making it to the Senate. And the people like A. Harry Moore and a few others way back. But I think they expected to have a much longer dominance than they did. But they did have Hughes, Byrne, Cahill. They had a little streak going there.
Who supplanted them? Who was coming up behind the Irish?
I think it's just become more diverse in New Jersey politics. People are less identify with groups, more identify with other interests in their lives.
Were the Italians an important group in New Jersey politics in that time?
They were certainly one of the squeaky wheels who felt they didn't get their due at that time.
Were Jews an important group?
Well, yeah, I think they've always been critical to the Democratic Party, and the Wilentz family and the Hess family and other powerful Jewish families in New Jersey were very key people in Democratic circles. I think in the Republican Party, you had a sort of milder mirror image of it, but with the kind of Morris County WASP, ancient, land grants from the king kind of basis for.
Are you saying that the Republicans were the party of the WASPs and the Democrats were the party of the ethnics?
Yeah, they were at that time. You could simplify it that way.
Were African Americans a political force in those days?
African Americans were becoming a political force. Howard Woodson became the Speaker of the Assembly, and he was a powerful figure, genuinely powerful figure. A minister, Speaker of the Assembly, something we've seen in other places in the country.
And Latino or Hispanic was not a word?
Not a factor at that time, and no Asians to speak
Um, did you work for Hughes until the end of the
No,
administration?
I wanted to get out as I had always planned, so I went to Washington. And I came back.
What'd you do in Washington?
I worked and I was executive director of a White House task force on the cities in the late Johnson administration. And
Who was the chair of that task force?
Paul Ilvasacker. That's how I got to know Paul so well.
Tell us about him and the role he... Did you recruit him to New Jersey?
I did, actually.
When and what role did he end up playing here?
When I met Paul when I was a student at the Woodrow Wilson School. And when we set up the Department of Community Affairs, which happened on the last day of the legislative session in 1966, not even clear that the legislature knew what it was doing, but it was it was a proposal actually that had grown out of some professors at Princeton, and I was still very close to those people. We needed to make it into something, and that depended heavily on who we recruited as a commissioner. And if you think back to that time, the cities were seething. We had had some problems in '65, and we were due to have many more, and as you know, riots here in 1967 in Newark. And the expert in the world of thinking about cities was Paul Ilvasacker at that time. He was at the Ford Foundation. And I called Paul up to ask his advice about, I didn't know him well until a year later with the task force, to ask his advice about what kind of person we could get. And I described what this job could be. And then there was something about the way he hesitated that made me say, of course, if we could ever get somebody like you. And there was something about the way he said no that made me rush into the governor's office and say, I think Paul Ilvasacker would be interested in this job. And of course, Hughes said, who's Paul Ilvasacker? But he lived in Cranberry, and we recruited him, and he did make the department into something.
He was the first commissioner of community affairs.
Yeah.
So you left Hughes in what year?
January '67.
When did you return to New Jersey state politics and government?
Well, I came back to teach, to finish my PhD and to teach. And then
at the Woodrow Wilson
At the
School.
Woodrow Wilson School. And I was there doing that and some other things. We started the Center for Analysis of Public Issues, which is the thing that Publishers New Jersey Reporter did. But I was teaching mostly, running that center. And so '73...
Were you the editor of the New Jersey Reporter?
We didn't call it that then. John Colasar. It was the original version of this was like a brochure, or not a brochure, a newsletter. And John there were four of us.
Who?
I was the director. I had John Colasar, Dave Beal, and Bob Powell. So they're all people around here. Went in different directions. Bob Powell got very wealthy, and the rest of us
in the
did other
development
things.
business.
Yes, he did.
And John Colasar became
the editor of the Camden
major
Courier-Post.
journalist in the state.
So we, and in '73, I should go back, this doesn't sound quite preposterous. Because of the Genovese case and because of my involvement in '65, there was an impression created that I was very clever about campaigns. My field is public finance. I didn't really know campaigns. I knew government. But it was significant enough so that even in '69, I was asked if I would come back to run Miner's campaign, who I didn't know at that time, by Joel Stearns and others, and I said no.
Miner was running for
He ran
election again?
Again, against Cahill.
He hadn't been governor for 8 years.
Right.
So he was trying to make a comeback.
He was trying to make a comeback.
And what did you say when you were
I said
approached?
no. I wasn't interested in running
Why?
campaigns. Well, it wasn't what I thought I'd do. But a variety of things happened in the interim. The war in Vietnam and the beginnings of the ripples of Watergate, in my personal case, began to convince me that you could make the most difference by affecting who got elected. That the other stuff was important and it was dear to my heart, but nothing mattered as much as having people who were headed in the right direction.
You still believe that 35
Yeah,
years later?
I still do. I think you can exaggerate the importance of a particular figure, and we always do. We magnify their faults and their strengths, and we make their whims into policy ideas or trends. But it is very important. And I knew Byrne a bit. The state had fallen back into disgrace and scandal in 73, 72, 73, as you'll recall.
Just refresh my memory a little bit.
Well,
What had happened?
In the Cahill administration, I liked Bill Cahill, and there were many good things he tried to do. But a couple of people high up in his administration got into difficulty. One of them was actually convicted of wrongdoing, basically fundraising that was inappropriate.
One was his Secretary of State?
And his treasurer also got into trouble
treasurer.
for some things. And, you know, the usual questions began to be raised about whether this was systematic. And I think there was evidence that there was a lot of it going on at lower levels. So the state hungered for someone who would be different. And, of course, the most different figure available was Brendan Byrne. Brendan Byrne was famous for only one reason. I mean, he had a great record on paper. He'd been a navigator in World War II, went to Harvard Law School, you know, went to Princeton, went to Harvard Law School. He'd been secretary to Governor Minor. He'd been an outstanding prosecutor. He was an outstanding judge. But as a prosecutor, he had served during a period when the FBI was taping the mafia. And they had on tape a number of references to this guy Byrne, who nobody could get to. What's the matter with this guy Byrne? Doesn't he like money? What's the matter with this guy Byrne? Nobody can get to him. He was the man the mob couldn't buy. And people in New Jersey politics developed the notion that getting Byrne to run would be tantamount to winning the election. And so they persuaded Brendan to run. I was not involved at the time he announced. I watched. He contacted me.
You were
I
at
was
Princeton,
at Princeton, yeah.
getting a PhD, teaching?
No, I was done with a PhD. I finished a PhD in '69.
You were
I was
teaching and running the Center for Analysis of Public
Right.
Issues. Okay, go ahead. He contacted you.
Contacted me, and I met with him, but I wasn't. I thought it was great to have somebody who was going to fight corruption, but I didn't know where he was on lots of issues, and I didn't know that it was something that interested me, and I wasn't particularly eager to get back to Trenton. I still assumed that I'd wind up going to Washington or somewhere.
Do you recall what month he contacted you? What time frame?
March, April. He announced late, as I recall. And we spent about 10 days going back and forth, and a couple of things emerged. One was I was very pleased with the positions he was prepared to take on issues. And the second was, and I don't know if I quite believed him at the time, because it seemed unusual, that he was prepared to give me complete authority.
As governor or as a campaign
as
operative?
Campaign manager.
Campaign manager.
Yeah. And he did in fact do that. I mean, I can tell you one story that's illustrative of it. I was there for a few weeks, and the state chairman designate, Jim Dugan, Hudson County senator, decided I was sending the wrong message to people in politics about Byrne and his campaign, and he complained.
What message was that? A liberal message?
Well, a liberal message, a message that the organization people wouldn't have as much access, that we were going to reform everything. So Byrne called a meeting at Ellen Sagner's house. Ellen Sagner was the finance committee chair at that time, and it was just Sagner and Dugan and Byrne and me, and I had no idea what to expect. And I sat down, and Brendan said to Jim, I'll tell you what this meeting's about. This meeting's about whether or not you're going to be involved in the campaign, because Leone's running it. And I'll never forget that moment, because it was rather shocking.
How old were you?
This was 32.
How old was Dugan?
Dugan was a Korean War vet, so he had to be 15, 20 years older. I think my own time in Trenton under Byrne, not under Hughes. Under Hughes, I was this young guy wrote speeches, came up with policy ideas, made jokes. Under Byrne, I had real authority and power, and as I've gotten older, I realize how difficult that must have been for all the people who were 20, 30 years older. I also didn't have patience in those days. So that's a lethal combination.
Was Brendan Byrne your first choice as governor that year?
He was once he announced, yeah. Before that, I was struggling. I thought maybe Dick Coffey was serious about reforming things. And in fact, before that, I thought that the Republicans could very well win the race. They wound up in the event nominating Charlie Sandman, so they gave up any chance they had to win the race. We could have won the race, with anybody.
It was Watergate time. Didn't it look like you were going to prevail anyway? It was tough for Republicans that year.
I think anybody who came up, though, with a reformer or anti-corruption person would have had a chance. And the traditional political figures, I can't remember who they all were, Ed Crabeel, people like that, were not going to do it. They might have won because it was Watergate. New Jersey was not a reliably Democratic state in those days.
So were you the campaign manager of that first
Right.
Byrne campaign?
Right.
And who were the key people on your team?
Well, Herb Wolf I brought in from the Trenton Times to be the press secretary.
He had been the editor of the Trenton Times?
Well, he became editor later. He was a political reporter in the State House. Luke Hayden was in charge of policy and subsequently became counsel to the governor.
Who brought him in?
I brought him in.
How'd you know him?
I met Lou in '68. He was been first in his class at Harvard Law School, and he was on Bobby Kennedy's staff. And Bobby Kennedy announced for president he was coming to Camden to give a speech. And somebody told Hayden, who was writing the speech, to call me to ask about what he should say. And they had this speech where he was going to talk about Walt Whitman and and I made a big impression on Lou over the phone by saying, "You're out of your mind. This is Camden. You got to talk about jobs. You got to talk about, you can imagine the conversation." So we became fast friends. He was a man from Mars to the New Jersey politicians, and they never accepted him. In fact, he never moved to New Jersey, which was another story. Commuted from Central Park South, but New Jersey at one time had living on Central Park South, the governor's council, the commissioner of transportation, and the congressman from Jersey City. And the chief justice later, but he had a good reason. So I brought Lou in to do that. I hired Joe Hoffman, who I knew from the Hughes days, to do a lot of the constituent and
Who was Joe
organizational work.
Hoffman?
Joe Hoffman was a lawyer who wanted to be attorney general, and a talented guy. He'd been in the Hughes circle. He became commissioner of labor, and he actually ran against Byrne in the primary 4 years later. So that was probably inopportune, but seemed like a good idea at the time. Joe Gannon was brought in to do politics. Subsequently was killed in an auto accident. And Dan Horgan was brought in to do the state committee, who died years later of a heart attack. They're both very, very talented guys. I brought Jim Ruth in to run the operations. Jim Ruth was a former Army major and Woodrow Wilson School MPA who was very organized. And that's what I wanted him to be in charge of all of the purchasing and the way all the money got spent and organized, so that I wouldn't have to worry about any impropriety. I had to worry that he'd be sure to get the union bugs on, because that didn't occur to him, but we didn't have to worry about impropriety. Jim was, again, not what they were used to. And there are a variety of younger people, some of whom went on to bigger and better things, like Bob Torricelli and Jerry English, and a variety of
What was
kids in the
Torricelli?
campaign. He was, I think, 19 or 20 years old. He was around the headquarters now. Donald Payne was on there.
What was the Brendan Byrne strategy?
Oh, the strategy was simple. We would nail the case that Brendan Byrne was going to change the way public business was done. And we would make clear to people that Brendan Byrne was a mainstream candidate and Charlie Sandman wasn't. You can sum up the Sandman story with a couple of things. Charlie Sandman, and this is not campaign rhetoric, voted against hot and cold running water for migrant workers. Charlie Sandman voted against $1.25 minimum wage. Charlie Sandman was the one guy to stand up for Nixon on that committee to the end. And Charlie Sandman was a man you could get 70% of the vote against, and we did. So it was not like the second campaign. I mean, this was a campaign where the strategy was to get them to know as much as possible about Brendan Byrne because they would like that, and get them to know as much as possible about Charlie Sandman because they wouldn't like that. By contemporary standards, it was a gentlemanly, perfectly nice campaign where the only things that were used were, you know, this guy voted for this and not for that. A lot of what is now conventional campaigning hadn't been invented yet, or at least I wasn't aware of it.
Did you run a media campaign?
We had a media campaign. We had David Garth do the media campaign. We did a modest amount of media by contemporary standards.
Was David Garth the guru yet at that point in time?
Not in our campaigns, no.
Later he became this well-known media guru of campaigning?
He was somewhat known for New York City campaigns. He hadn't done very many campaigns outside of New York.
In the primary, you had a primary
Yes,
that you had
we
to
did.
get through.
We didn't run any commercials in the primary, which is a statement about how politics has changed.
And you were running against Ann Klein and
And Craybill,
Ed Craybill.
Ed Craybill from Middlesex County, and who I think I'm forgetting a couple of people.
Did Joe LaFonte run?
Yeah.
Ralph
Ralph
DeRose.
DeRose ran. Ralph DeRose from Essex County.
Was it? Were there key bosses involved in that primary who had to be?
Well, Hudson
had to be
County
won?
supported Byrne from the beginning.
Why would Hudson support this Essex guy?
I think they misjudged him, to be completely honest. I think they thought he was one of them.
Meaning?
One of the boys, you know, one of the Irish Catholic pals from northern New Jersey who'd understand that you had to take care of your friends and do favors for people, and they'd have a lot of access. They also thought he could win. I mean, he was an instrument where they could head off Essex County's aspirations with Ralph DeRose, Ann Klein, who was the liberal left candidate in the race, of course, wouldn't have had any support, and Ed Craybill representing the Middlesex organization. I don't think there was a South Jersey candidate.
So Brendan Byrne from Essex County was not the Essex County candidate?
No. Neither time, actually.
Huh. The governor told us in an interview yesterday about a man named Fitzpatrick in Bayonne. Do you recall
Sure.
him and his role in this?
Well, Fitzpatrick and I've got to remember the name of the guy from Harrison because
Frank Rogers.
Frank Rogers, because in Harrison I think we got like 3,000 votes to 13, and you know you could have 13 mistakes. Frank Fitzpatrick and Frank Rogers, or I might have Fitzpatrick, they were solidly for Byrne. Now they were truly for Byrne. They believed, you know, Brendan Byrne was the kind of kid they wished they'd had, you know, to grow up and be that sort of person. I mean, they're politicians, and I don't want to be naive about them, but I think they were genuine supporters of Byrne.
Brendan told us a story about Fitzpatrick and a bridge, some bridge.
Oh,
that was,
yeah. We were going to double-deck it in the second campaign. That was always my job. The Bayonne Bridge. You had to promise that you would build a Bayonne Bridge. Everybody knew you weren't going to build another Bayonne Bridge.
Another bridge, not that little bridge
another
between Bayonne and Staten Island?
Right.
They wanted a new bridge?
I can't even remember where it was, but it was one of those pleasant fictions in politics that doesn't harm anybody. And it really is true that in the second campaign, they said, what are we going to say about the Bayonne Bridge? And I said, well, tell them we're double-decking it.
There was thought at the time that Henry Helstosky might run for governor.
Yes, and he was actually endorsed by, in '69, he ran against Minor. He had but there was a feeling he would come back. He had some personal stories which were freight that made it difficult for him to do that. And I think he also wound up without any particular constituency.
He was a congressman from Bergen County. That's not enough of a constituency to run for governor?
Not in those days.
And he had ethical clouds?
Well, there
or-
were stories about abuse of his wife, but I don't know that they were ever confirmed.
If he had run, would it have made a difference?
No, I think, this is probably an additive history, but it is the way I remember it. I remember the lead in the New York Times story when Brendan Byrne announced being something like, Brendan Byrne, comma, the man the mob couldn't buy, comma, today announced he was going to win.
What was he like as a candidate?
Oh, he was a terrible candidate. He was a worse speaker than Bill Bradley, and he hated it. He used to do things like, I had a fellow who traveled with him I had in charge of the road show named Fariborz Fatimi.
Named what?
Fariborz Fatimi, Iranian family. And he would make Fariborz get out of the car and go off with the driver on his own because he was sick of it. He would sit in a room and he would say, I can't do this anymore. This is horrible. I hate this. He became, you see what he's become today. He became really good at all this stuff. But at first he genuinely hated it. I think if it had been a tough campaign, it might have been different, but it didn't matter.
Once the primary was over, once Sandman was the opponent, you knew you were going to win.
Yes.
So why did you even bother to campaign?
Well, I think you could lose a campaign by not campaigning.
Did he have any strengths as a candidate?
He was very good on issues. He really understood things. Very smart man, Brendan Byrne. Not just on legal issues, where he's genuinely remarkable, but on other things. He would grasp them, he would understand them, he could discuss them. Core convictions, and they were clear. He made only one mistake that came back to haunt us.
Tell us about that.
Well, hovering in the background was the question about whether he'd propose an income tax. And the campaign strategy was to not make a commitment that he would not have an income tax. And there was no need to. I mean, we were ahead by a very wide margin. And right near the end of the campaign, and one of those moments that sometimes happens when you're campaigning day after day and you're tired, somebody caught him somewhere, I think in Monmouth County, one of you guys, some reporter, and asked him the question about the income tax, and he said, I don't see the need for an income tax in the foreseeable future. Key phrase was foreseeable future. And that came back to haunt him, because he couldn't wait to get that off his conscience after he got elected and make clear that he was going to go for the income tax.
Well, since he had no real serious fight for the governorship, why not just say, and deal with it head on and announce that if elected, you'll push the income tax as your predecessors did?
I've known Brendan for 30-some years, and we've never, either of us, been clear on why that happened. These things happen.
What was your feeling as campaign manager about how to handle that issue?
You mean after I settled down?
Well, no. Prior to his ad lib.
Prior to it, I mean, look, the way politics works in practical terms, not just in New Jersey, but particularly in New Jersey, and I know something about that, is if you either take the pledge of no tax, or you say, I'm going to do whatever's necessary. I'm not going to pledge that I won't raise taxes. People understand those two positions. You're not going to raise taxes if you don't have to, but you're saying, in effect, you will if you do have to. It's a very important distinction, and in this case, it was just an unnecessary trouble. In the fullness of time, I doubt that it would have made any difference. I think if he said he was for the income tax, it wouldn't have made any difference. It would have taken this long and been that difficult anyway. Because ultimately, getting the income tax required two things. It required getting the public to believe that you really needed to do something. And they did not believe that. That was the main problem. They didn't understand or believe that something had to be done. The second thing was convincing a group of legislators that it was worth risking their careers, or maybe in some cases because of the way they thought, ending their careers in order to do this one thing that was necessary, which is very hard and very individual, psychological more than political, because you can't tell anybody, this is going to be good for you. Michael, this will make you governor or make you senator if you just support a new tax. I mean, taxes ought to be hard to pass because people don't want them and we're a democracy. They ought to require convincing people that they're absolutely necessary. They ought to require making the case painstakingly over time because otherwise you'll waste the money. And they do finally require a group of people to make a political sacrifice. They were at the state level. That's what requires political courage. I judge people in politics by the fights they take on, literally not by anything else. Because when you take on a fight that's really hard, that's going to hurt you out of conviction, and you stay the course, which is also, I'd say, the rarest thing in politics is staying the course. Sometimes that can be bad. You know, the course can be wrong. But it's a very hard thing to do, and in retrospect, our strategy for getting the income tax was to take our time and move the public along through this school controversy and get people to the point where they realized there was a genuine crisis and something had to be done, and the only thing that was fair was the income tax because we needed additional revenue at the state level. We lost at both ends. First, the comment during the campaign created a set of expectations that were wrong. And then we didn't go through the process after the election. Right away, actually Byrne said, Leone's convinced we need an income tax, and you know whatever convinces Leone convinces me. You could check the Daily News on that, which was not the way...
Shortly after being elected?
The election. It was not ideal. So the answer to your question is we didn't have a strategy.
How important were the newspapers and television coverage in getting elected?
Oh, they were crucially important because we had an unknown candidate, completely unknown. Just insiders had heard of Brendan Byrne. And because of what the media saw as the way to define Byrne, we immediately had an antidote in people's minds to what they identified at that point as the biggest problem in the state, corruption. And it wasn't just somebody promising to do it. It was somebody with a relevant record who actually had gone after people.
So this was the ideal candidate for the moment, wasn't it?
It was.
Which newspapers were important at that time? Well,
this is after the Newark News. So the Star-Ledger was already the most important paper in the state. In some ways, the Star-Ledger was even more important then than it is now because it had a single man directing it with an agenda and things like building the Meadowlands.
Was that Mort Pye?
Mort Pye. So the Star-Ledger was extremely important. The Jersey Journal is a different kind of paper. I always call it the quasi-official Jersey Journal because it moves with the tides there in Hudson County. The Home News was a relatively important paper. The Trenton Times was an independent paper and quite a strong voice in the state. At that time, there was a New Jersey edition of the Daily News, and there were 8 or 10 reporters based in New Jersey. They had a bureau, and it was the largest selling paper in the state.
Really?
So it actually had importance that's today,
Was John McLaughlin at the Daily News?
John McLaughlin was writing a column then. And of course the Times, the New York Times always, and the Inquirer have influence in the commuter communities that are out of proportion to their readership because those people vote and they're active. They contribute.
Would you say their influence today is greater, lesser, or the same as it was 35 years ago?
Well, there's still, as you know, limited commercial television coverage. It's only at the end of a campaign that those stations bother to give some kind of report. So I think they remain very important because they're proxies for the public opinion. I don't know how much they actually convince the public, but for people in politics who are desperate to know what the public is hearing and seeing and thinking, The papers become a proxy for that. You know,
They're important to the
and then
politicians.
they affect behavior because of that.
And that's true today as well.
Sure it is. I mean, people react to editorials, for example. All the evidence shows very few. How many people read an editorial in the Asbury Park Press and indeed not only read it, but are influenced in their future voting behavior because of that editorial they read 3 years ago? But you get an editorial in the Asbury Park Press of a certain kind or anywhere else, and everybody talks about it as though something had shifted in the political landscape.
Who were the key fundraisers for Brendan Burns' first bid for election?
Well, it was our intention that Archie Alexander Jr. would be the top fundraiser. And
who was he?
He was the son of a former State Department official, and he was a Princeton lawyer and very distinguished guy. Turned out he couldn't raise money. But there was this guy none of us knew named Alan Sagner. The amounts of money you raised in those days are ridiculously small by today's standards, who actually could organize a fundraiser. And I was a point where I convinced Brendan that we were going to demote Archie Alexander and make Alan Sagner the finance chair.
And who was Alan Sagner?
Alan Sagner was a developer from North Jersey with a long history of support for very liberal causes, who immediately came under attack from Anthony Imperiali because of his left-wing background. And Alan Sagner's an old Roosevelt liberal.
How did you meet him?
I met him in the campaign. None of us knew him.
How did he join the campaign? He just knocked on the door?
I don't know how he came in the door, but he had a meteoric rise.
Because he could raise money.
He could do it. He could cut it. Campaigns are pretty ruthless about judging people. You really can't, in the part of the campaign that's the real campaign, as opposed to all the groups and meetings and flutter and stuff you do to keep people happy. In the part that's really driving a campaign, it's unforgiving. There's a ruthless logic about it. You either can do it or you can't do it. You're in or you're out. I'll tell you, just to digress for a second, I realized something during the Corzine transition that I didn't know. Most transitions are organized before the election, and they involve a whole bunch of people who are sort of policy-oriented or who want to be involved, and they're the transition team and staff, and then you have this problem afterwards of figuring out what to do with the campaign staff and how to fit them in together. But Corzine had no pre-election transition. So we had to put the transition together after the election, which delayed things. But the people we used were all the campaign people because they were the ones who were there because nothing had happened. And I don't think the lost time was a loss at all because we had people who really could cut it, who work 7 days a week routinely, who don't think anything of working at night, who produce. And Sagner's one of those guys. He's 86 years old, and he's still one of those guys today. I don't know. But in those days, he was just a youngster.
Since you knew that you were going to beat Charlie Sandman, my understanding is that you set up a transition department.
Yes, I believe in transition over the summer.
Over the summer. And
I don't think it jinxes you. I think it's smart and healthy to do it.
And how did that relate to the campaign staff?
Did
you chair it?
It didn't. No, other people. I wound up chairing it after the election, but this had a life of its own.
Did you put somebody in charge of it?
No, they had assignments. They were in charge of specific areas. It couldn't be an area where they were interested in working. So if you wanted to be Attorney General, you couldn't work on law and public safety. You had to work on something else. That was the only rule I had.
But what about people's areas of expertise? You were taking them out of their areas of expertise?
I, by and large, picked people who I thought were sufficiently versatile that they could handle the areas. I drew heavily on two sources. The people I knew from the Hughes years, when I'd formed judgments about people and how they performed, and people from places like the Woodrow Wilson School and Princeton or else other networks who I thought could do this. There were very few people who represented traditional political constituency groups. We did have Ann Klein involved, and some of the people who've been involved in the primary. But I didn't know that I'd be running the transition till the morning after. The morning after the election, Brendan said to me, "You can have whatever you want." And I said, "Well, what do you want?" He said, "Well, I want you to be chief of staff." And I said, "No, I won't be chief of staff."
Why not?
Well, I mentioned to you how centralized things were under Byrne. They really were centralized. When his father died, this was a couple of weeks after I'd signed on, he wanted me to handle all the arrangements. I mean, he wanted one person. And I didn't think that was the right way to do this. I thought he would be better served by having more voices and more people, and we ought to broaden that circle.
So you wanted to take up a position farther away from him than directly beneath him?
I thought I should take on the toughest problem, which was the budget and taxes. That's what I know about Treasury. And I thought if I went into the governor's office, there would be no change or movement. It'd still be the people I knew. And I think I was right about that. We had a little bit of a struggle about it. He did get me to be in charge of the transition. And then he said, fine. I did hire the governor's office staff people and set their salaries, which is unconventional. That was on the first round, obviously.
As transition director?
Yeah.
During the September-October run-up to the election, were there tensions between the campaign staff and the transition staff?
No, there was very little interaction.
Who did the transition staff?
There were people, as you get close to an election, particularly one that you're clearly going to win, anxieties and insecurities emerge. People wonder where they're going to wind up. It's always a good idea to designate people as soon as you can so that at least there's some group that's functional and not wondering what's going to happen to them. It also means that other people have somebody to relate to, because you get ripples of insecurity and uncertainty. Not only do the people not know what jobs they're going to get, but the people who care about who's going to get those jobs don't know who's going to get those jobs. So one of the things I did during the Corzine transition is press him to name key people in the governor's office quickly. I think in the Byrne campaign, everybody knew that was a very different time in my life. Everybody knew I would be in the administration. And they were in varying ways trying to adjust to how unhappy that made them. But varying degrees of unhappiness.
So if you made yourself, or if you suggested to Byrne that he make you treasurer, who did you suggest to him that he make chief of staff?
Well, I had a couple of ideas for chief of staff, but we had a little pool of very talented people we thought we had to place in various places. One of them was Bob Mulcahy, and we thought that Ann Klein needed Bob Mulcahy to take on that job. There was another fellow named Manny Carballo, the late
Wait a
Manny
second,
Carballo.
Ann Klein would be what?
She was Human Services, what's now Human Services.
So, and she would need him as chief of
As
staff?
deputy, but there were deputies then. There wasn't a chief of staff in the departments.
Deputy commissioner.
Yeah, and Manny Carballo, who was an enormously talented guy, we thought should be the deputy to Alan Sagner, who was going to be the transportation commissioner. We kind of backed into the chief of staff decision, I think, and without slighting anybody.
Who was it?
Who was Don Land. But he didn't function in the way chief of staff would function now. I mean, Luke Hayden and others had direct, and Herb Wolf had direct access to the governor.
Don Land had been a Union County, what, a politician or a...
He was in politics. He had a business, successful business of some kind.
Was he the county chairman in Union?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
He was an early Byrne supporter. He was a very amiable, friendly guy, and part of that job, we thought at that time, was dealing with legislators and people who were interested in what the governor was doing. It was not so much having authority over the governor's office. That kind of evolved. You couldn't tell me who Bill Cahill's chief of staff was. Hughes had no chief of staff. So the chief of staff really evolved under Mulcahy and Hodis. That was been elsewhere.
Mulcahy and Hodis under Byrne.
Under Byrne. That was the first time the New Jersey governor had a chief of staff who was the chief of staff the way we think of it now. So it was Byrne's later chiefs of staff who defined that office.
What was the executive secretary to the governor position?
I mean, those people, like Jimmy McLaughlin was Hughes' executive secretary, and he really had less authority than almost anybody in the office. So the titles weren't as important as I say. Joe Katz was clearly the closest thing to a chief of staff under Hughes. Under Byrne, for a while I continued to function somewhat in that capacity, but I became completely swallowed by the tax battle, the budget and tax battle. We had 3 years of budget and tax battles, and that's what I did for 3 years.
Did you inherit a budget crisis?
Yeah, that's a funny story. The two funny stories about the transition. One is having dinner with Cahill and Dick DeCourt, who was his counsel and a friend of mine at Morven. And Cahill said, oh, you know that surplus? Started laughing. They both started laughing uproariously. There's no surplus. There's a big deficit. And I said, well, why are you springing this on us? And he said, well, we thought it would help Sandman if that got out, so we didn't want it to get out. I mean, remember, Sandman beat Cahill in the primary.
Uh-huh.
So the only person who wanted Sandman to lose more than we did. The other meeting with DeCourt and
who was DeCourt again?
He was counsel to Governor Cahill. He was a former legislator, very able guy. Another, actually, this was a breakfast or a dinner I had with, it was dinner, again at Morven with DeCourt and Cahill. And we're talking about appointments in the transition. And this was an extremely cooperative transition. I mean, not only did they keep open the jobs and positions, appointments we wanted, but in one case they appointed a prosecutor to fill a slot so that we wouldn't be able to fulfill our promise to someone we'd promised it to but didn't want to give it to. So we're near the end of the dinner, and Cahill says, oh, one other thing, Dick. I'm going to appoint a Chief Justice. And I said, Governor, we won't be able to stand for that. And he started chuckling, and he said, oh, you'll stand for this. It's Dick Hughes. So the next morning I went to see Brendan. And I gave him my report, and at the end of it I said, one other thing, Governor, important thing. He's going to appoint a Chief Justice. And Brendan started to get up out of his chair, and I said, it's Dick Hughes. And he sat back down. And oh. Now, we were happy with the Hughes appointment, obviously. I was very happy.
Why did Cahill pick Hughes?
They really liked each other. And he thought Hughes would do what a Chief Justice needed to do then. Remember, Cahill had gone for an income tax to support the schools, and that what predates Abbott is the decision Robinson versus Cahill, and they thought Hughes, and they were right.
What was Cahill like?
I liked Cahill. I had a couple of experiences with him that really impressed me. When we were doing work at the Center for Analysis of Public Issues, we did a report on the State Consumer Protection Agency that was very critical of it. And I took it down to Trenton to George Kugler, who was the Attorney General. And he said, wow, this is really damning if it's true. Wait a minute, come on, let's go see the governor. And we went over to see the governor. I had met Cahill, but I really didn't know him. I mean, they fired the guy who ran the agency. Cahill then appointed me to this commission looking at medical education. I mean, Kugler was an exceptional Attorney General. I think you'd have to ask other AGs whether they agree with that, but my sense was he really changed that office. And Cahill was a guy who had a lot of guts on a lot of things. I think was ill-served by some people, and probably if he'd been a little luckier about that, would have had 2 terms and would be remembered as a great, successful governor.
Was he sort of a Kane-style Republican?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He was a moderate Republican. New Jersey was mostly moderate Republicans. Sandman was an outlier. The New Jersey Republican Party today is much more conservative than it was then.
So how Clifford Case,
Yeah,
the
Clifford
U.S.
Case
Senator.
was, you know, to
Liberal
the left of our current senators.
So how did Sandman beat the sitting governor in a primary?
Corruption and the tax.
Uh-huh.
He ran against him saying he was, going to foreign income tax, but it was basically the scandals were happening in real time when the campaign was going on, so it was pretty hard for Kano.
Give us a sense of the atmosphere inside the campaign leading up to Election Day.
I think most people were confident, but there were people, including Brendan Byrne, who started to get nervous at the end.
Why?
Well, the candidates and the rest of us often confuse the experience we're having with the experience the voters are having, and sometimes that can lead you in the wrong direction completely. And he was encountering some resistance to his message, and even encountering, this is amusing in retrospect, some criticism of the fact that he hadn't been strong enough in swearing that he'd never support an income tax. In fact, one of the people who felt that way was David Wilentz, the venerable head of the Middlesex County organization. We were probably, we won by 40 points. We were probably 35 points ahead when this came up as a problem, and I had to go see Wilentz.
What did he say to you?
He told me kind of what he was hearing at the grassroots. It's the fact that most people in politics grow up on this anecdotal information, and it does impress you. It does. And then there's another way of looking at campaigns that is highly driven by research, and it's not perfect, but it has great advantages. And I had the advantage of the research. There were not many public polls, which is, again, a reminder of how different politics is today. And I didn't share the polling we did. I never have understood that you pay a lot of money for those polls. It's very hard to interpret them properly. The public and public opinion are dynamic. The polls are a snapshot. They tell you some things about the dynamic, but they don't tell you much about what can come to be true.
When you say you didn't share them, what do you mean you didn't share them with whom?
Anybody in the campaign.
Really?
Yeah.
How about the candidate? How about the candidate?
In either campaign.
How about the candidate?
I did share it with the candidate as a form of reassurance at this time. But
you were paying for good polling.
Well, the media people had it. The people who were making the strategy for the campaign had access to the polls. But I didn't see any reason to put it in the paper. First of all,
why not? You create a sense of inevitability.
Well, I think journalists ought to discredit anything a campaign says about its own polls. And secondly, why would I pay for polls and then give them to the other side? And in the first campaign, I didn't want there to be overconfidence, which the polls certainly would have provided. In the second campaign, I didn't want there to be despair. The second campaign, on Labor Day, Brendan Byrne was behind by 26 points. I didn't want to share that information.
Do you remember Election Day?
Very clearly.
Describe it.
I rode around with Byrne on Election Day. I didn't do that in the campaign since the work to be done was done in the headquarters. But by this Election Day, I thought that was a luxury I could afford and we'd enjoy it. Everything was happening that was supposed to happen. And, you usually get positive feedback even if you're going to lose big on Election Day when you go around. People always talk about their great crowds at the end when they're losing big. But we really did get a good response. He was a little nervous. We went back to his house.
He lived in West Orange?
West Orange, yeah. Nymph Drive or Nymph Road, I think, whatever it was. And he went upstairs. This is a story I'm sure Brendan will tell you. He's one of his favorite stories. I had written a speech for him. And it was, it anticipated the victory. And he said to me, Dick, what should I say if I lose? And I said, Brendan, you can say anything you want. Which is a story he tells all the time. And then, I forget whether it was 60 seconds or 120 seconds after the polls closed, all the television stations called the election for Byrne. And he came downstairs and he seemed vastly relieved, which actually is normal, although it surprised me a little bit at the time.
That's exactly the word he used yesterday to describe his feeling that night.
Really relieved. Well, Brendan Byrne, in a way, was a man who, while he didn't set out on this course to be elected governor, it was the logical pinnacle of the kind of life he led, and the family he came from, and the things he did in New Jersey, and the stuff he accomplished. You know, to be governor was, and this, I always felt this was kind of an affirmation that it had all worked out.
Do you recall where in the state you had your headquarters that night?
I know the headquarters was in Union, New Jersey, because
The campaign headquarters.
Campaign headquarters. People criticized the size of the campaign as it being the Grand Army of the Republic. Union, New Jersey. That's right. It's got a kick out of.
How about the celebration?
I can't remember
Okay.
what hotel it is.
I think Brendan Byrne told us that immediately after an exhausting experience running, campaigning for governor, he took a trip to Arizona. That's his recollection.
I thought it was St. Croix, that first trip.
I think he said that there was a subsequent trip to
That might have
St.
been,
Croix.
yeah. Because I went to St. Croix with him. We all went to St.
Who do you recall going to St. Croix?
Marty Greenberg. I'm not sure who else. No, a small group.
All right, you've won the election. What do you have to do at this point?
Well, we set out to set up a transition, a formal transition operation. In those days, it was pretty primitive. You had a couple of offices provided in Trenton, so you had to have everything else somewhere else. The Cahill administration was quite cooperative in providing us with a certain amount of support. We basically took the scheduling operation and moved it into the transition. One of the things about a transition is that you have to create a miniature, two things in miniature: a campaign organization, because you're still out there doing things, being asked by the press about everything. You have to move the governor-elect around. You have to deal with mail. You have lots of people in contact with you. And you're a kind of miniature government, because you immediately inherit problems. People want you to answer them. I always use the phrase, all questions should be answered by there's only one governor at a time. But you do some things you can't avoid. We had an immediate crisis because the Meadowlands deal had fallen through. And we had a hole in the ground and no deal anymore, no ability to finance the Meadowlands. And the Cahill administration really had no ability to do it at that stage. They had no power in the legislature. And a variety of other small issues that we had to turn our attention to right away. We had to set up a formal structure for the transition with groups of people looking at the various departments for two reasons. One, you can actually discover things you need to know, and you usually will not get those things from the department reports. Even on this latest round with Corzine, those reports are by and large not very useful. Second reason is you want to be open to engaging people who have something to contribute so they don't feel left out. You know, all of us have been passed over for jobs that we're absolutely convinced we deserved. I know in my case, endless numbers of cabinet jobs in Washington. And I always think about that during a transition, because there are going to wind up being many disappointed people. There are going to be a lot of talented people who have every reason to think they are qualified and ought to be sitting in the cabinet chair. But there's only going to be one selected. So you want the process to give people a sense that they had a fair shot, that they were heard, that they were treated respectfully. You're still going to wind up, and I have had this experience, now this is 30-some years on, you still run into people who basically are mad at you because they didn't get what they felt they should have gotten. But anyway, that selection of those people is crucial. You will make mistakes, and you will pay for every mistake you make. You don't get away with any. So you want to minimize those mistakes. You want those people, you're going to live on them, depend on them, rely on them. You've got to look into their souls if you can to avoid. I always have a final conversation with people when I say, I know as you're sitting here you don't think this is true, but believe me, this is true. Everything you've ever done may come out, will affect you or your family. things we can't possibly discover right now, but you know are there. And you've got to sit here one more time with me and tell me that under those circumstances you're willing to expose yourself, your family, and the governor to your appointment to something where there's going to be scrutiny. No. I've had people drop out at that stage.
Really?
No, I've had people tell me things that I really didn't need to know, where I say, no, that doesn't matter. That's not what I'm talking about. But I've also been through that where people clearly just either are oblivious to their own faults or lie to you. I mean, famously, when they were vetting Jerry Ferraro, she, at a time when her husband was under investigation for by three separate agencies about those real estate deals, which never amounted to anything, but it would have been nice to know. She said, no, there's nothing going on in my family. So I don't know what that is. So you start that process and you want to be rigorous about it. In the case of Byrne, we had a couple of advantages. We had some very experienced people we involved right from the beginning. I think particularly Bill Hyland, who wound up being the Attorney General, who had been the President of the Board of Public Utilities, who's first-rate, top-flight person, and we engaged him early on.
Early on after the election?
Yes, to be involved. We engaged several lawyers who Luke Hayden brought to us. David Oxman, one of the important ones. Brendan actually got John Degnan involved. We had done an investigation of Brendan ourselves in the spring. We wanted to know everything that anybody could ever use against him. And we'd spent a day at his house, a very uncomfortable day at his house in West Orange, raising every awkward question that could conceivably come up. So we started to do that for some of these key jobs. In that sense, we were ahead of our time.
You didn't hire an investigative agency, which is what's done nowadays.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think nowadays the pressure is even greater. A lot of that pressure was self-generated. I was kind of obsessed with it personally because there had been scandals in the Hughes administration, scandals in the Cahill administration, and we wanted to avoid that as far as possible. Brendan had made very few promises. At the cabinet level, really none. There were a couple of people he wound up appointing because of political debts he felt he owed them, but they hadn't been explicit promises. In a couple of cases, we set up search committees. We had Robert Willentz, this is before he became Chief Justice, lead a search committee for the Commissioner of Education. We had a search committee for the Commissioner of Environmental Protection. We found people out of state, Fred Burke in Rhode Island, who actually was not very successful. David Bardeen, who was in Israel, who was very good at his job, although he had a habit of calling me very early in the morning on Sundays.
How early?
Really early. He would take Saturday off as the Sabbath and then call 6 or 7 o'clock on Sunday morning to catch up until we finally put a stop to that. But he was a very talented man. Still probably is for that matter. So it was the search was of a variety, involved a variety of competences and places to look. Most of the people obviously came from New Jersey. The governor's office largely came out of the campaign, which is not unusual. We began very quickly to recruit other people to be, I mean, the times sometimes drive what jobs seem important. One of the most important places to us seemed the division of purchase and property.
Why?
Because that's where there had been scandals through several administrations. And so that's why, so I recruited Earl Josephson, who was the investigative reporter who'd broken a lot of those stories, to come. I couldn't make him at that point head of purchase and property. In fact, as you probably know the story, he couldn't get confirmed forever. That used to require confirmation. But he did eventually keep that job into the first of Kane's years when he got rid of him. But that, today, I don't think you'd think about that as a key job.
It falls within the Treasury Department.
Yeah. The Division of Criminal Justice was a key appointment.
Who'd you put there?
Bob Del Tufo, as I recall. And deputy treasurer, Cliff Goldman, because Cliff Goldman's the best, and I knew him. He was my roommate at the Woodrow Wilson School. I was very lucky in that.
So you and Goldman ran the Treasury Department.
Right.
How about higher education?
Well, higher education, Ralph Dungan was there, who I had recruited in the Hughes administration. Okay, for obscure reasons, but mostly having to do with the fact that he was in the Kennedy White House, and I thought, wow, you get a guy from the Kennedy White House. He was ambassador to Chile.
A New Jersey guy?
Just coming back. No New Jersey roots. He served for a year or two under Byrne, but they fell out personally. I've always thought that it'd been interesting to ask Brendan why. I was never quite clear why. Personality more than anything else.
Had he stayed on in higher ed through
stayed
Cahill?
Through Cahill. Yeah.
And so you kept him on?
Yes, and he had done some important things. The medical school, getting that over from Seton Hall and reviving it. It's in ill repute today, but it was a great thing to do at the time.
What role did Stanley Van Ness
Stan-
get assigned to?
Stan
and who
had-
was Stanley?
Stan had been in counsel's office under Hughes. He'd served, and I knew him well from those days. And one of our campaign pledges had been to create a department of public advocate. And, I thought that Stan was my candidate for the first public advocate. And Brendan thought a lot of him. And there wasn't even a contest for that job.
Was it a tough sell to create a public advocate department?
Not when you get 70%. In the initial weeks, things like that were easy.
And of course, nobody knew at that time how controversial a public advocate department would become 20 years later.
Yeah, we did, though. To Brendan's credit, he was, he was setting a watchdog on his own administration. He was pretty good about things like that.
Why was Stanley Van Ness the right person for that?
Absolute integrity, clearly going to try to make something out of the department. No political ambitions. It was, I don't know, it was one of the easier choices we had. Alan Sagner at Transportation was an easy choice. By then we really knew him well. He really understood how to do big projects. We trusted him.
How about Ann Klein?
Ann Klein, there was a little controversy about. People felt that Ann Klein was not a team player, that she was more of an advocate than a cabinet member.
An advocate for?
Well, for causes, including the causes that were represented by that department.
Human Services.
Human Services, poor people, children, abused people, mental health. And it was ultimately because Brendan Byrne bought the idea that we probably needed somebody who'd make us all uncomfortable. And she did. She would fight for that department. And
Well, she had run against him in the primary.
yes, she had.
So he was ready, willing, and able to embrace her?
Yes, absolutely.
Why? Or had she capitulated?
No, she ran a good race. She actually did better than people expected. I think, first of all, the races were not personally nasty the way they tend to be today, which helps a lot. It's still somewhat unusual. I would make a generalization about politics. The people you really dislike are the people in your own party you fought, not the people in the other party. People in the other party, it's sort of, well, what do you expect? But this was not a case of that type. Brendan was even forgiving after the re-election campaign when almost everybody turned against him. He's not a guy. He may hold grudges, but he doesn't show the grudges. I don't know.
How about Pat Sheehan?
Pat was the mayor of New Brunswick. She was, at that time, considered a star who would probably, be a senator or a governor in her own right, and seemed like a natural for community affairs. There were some other mayors interested in the job and a few legislators. There was nobody like an Ilvesacker from outside the box. The health commissioner, Joanne Finley, had impressed us all in the process of interviewing people. Joanne gets mixed reviews in retrospect, but I think on the whole that's an appointment Brendan feels very good about. He doesn't regret too many of his appointments. Ed Crabeel caused some embarrassment, not because of anything he did in the administration, but because there was a controversy about things he'd done while he was in Middlesex County politics, and he left.
He had been Secretary of State?
Right,
or
briefly.
You made him Secretary of State?
Yeah. He was briefly there.
How about Phil Lampe?
Well, you know, the governor doesn't appoint the agriculture secretary. It's appointed by a board. Phil Lampe had been there forever. I was actually surprised when Corzine became governor to learn that he wasn't still there, but I guess immortality is not conferred on you by that virtue, but longevity is certainly part of the job. And, you know, we have the current agriculture secretary has been there a very long time.
Charlie Couperus was a Republican whom McGreevey brought in, but then the interim person, Art Brown, was there through Republican and Democratic administrations.
I'm not sure of the chronology.
All right. As Brendan Byrne takes office, what did you feel were his major strengths and weaknesses in this new role?
I've always thought that his major strength was a character, that he had a set of core things he was going to stick to, against the death penalty, even though that was unpopular, running an ethical administration, even though that would be very unpopular with the leaders and with legislators. I did not know the strength of his character on the big tax issue and how much he was willing to stick to his guns. I think the most common thing in politics is to stake out a courageous position and then back away from it. Everything about politics induces you to back up when you confront a wall of pressure and your popularity starts to drop. There was no way of knowing how Brendan would handle this, but he was magnificent at times. I can remember a meeting with the legislative leaders, Pat Dodd and a couple of others, where they amounted to threatening him. And he said, you know, guys, I've been threatened by professionals. This doesn't bother me a bit.
Good line.
And it just, that was a severe test. I think in looking back on it, it's sometimes hard to remember. There was a point at which we did a poll and we asked Democrats, not people in general, just self-identified Democrats, this question: are there any circumstances under which you would vote for Brendan Byrne for re-election? And 69% of them said no. None of us had ever seen a poll like that. The pollster had never seen a poll like that. He was very unpopular. He's this charming, witty, revered figure, and I think rightly so, because he stayed the course and he forced everybody to reconsider. But people have forgotten how unpopular. He was more unpopular than Florio, more unpopular than anybody at the bottom of that thing.
Where did he need the most help? What were his weaknesses as a governor?
Well,
at the beginning.
He had the advantage in that he knew the political landscape well, and he knew the state government well. He'd been president of the Board of Public Utilities, executive secretary to Governor Minor, he'd been a judge understood the legal system very well. The budget was not a strength, and he had to get up to speed on the budget because he'd not been on that side of the government at all. The components of the budget, the kind of choices we had to make.
Remember the size of the budget back in?
$6 billion.
$6 billion, okay.
I remember that under Hughes, he brought it in at $999 million, so he wouldn't hit $1 billion one year. Time flies. I think that was an area where he had to get up to speed, unlike a Corzine, who, when you have a discussion with Corzine about something like financing the World Trade Center or the Meadowlands, refinancing the new stadium or something, I mean, you're talking present value, and he's looking at this deal versus that deal, and it's just all there. But Byrne was a quick study, and he caught up with all that stuff.
There was a sense, and I think you echoed it, that he was a weak public speaker. Did you ever give any thought, either during the campaign or after winning election, to getting him some coaching as a public speaker?
I think that he actually had a session or two, but wouldn't do it. You know, there's a characteristic that is so common among Democratic politicians that it must somehow be highly correlated with more liberal positions on issues. They refuse to do it. I know Walter Mondale refused to do it. John Corzine refuses to do it. It's an essential part of the job. And they refuse to do it, or they try it and they hate it and they won't do it anymore. The thing about Byrne is he got better. And by the time he did the re-election campaign, running against a very talented and attractive Republican, Ray Bateman, Byrne won those debates hand down. And I'm not saying that as a partisan. He really managed the flow of those debates. Now, that couldn't have happened 4 years earlier.
Did he need help in any other area as he approached taking office?
Oh, I think, you know, the scope of this job is much greater than people always talk about. You get a good businessman, or you get a good this. Nothing prepares people for the number of issues you have to deal with here. It's everything under the sun.
How did you and your team fix the Meadowlands financing issue?
Well, I remember making a speech to the 300 people at Wall Street in the bond community, talking about how converts sometimes are more fervent than those born to the faith, and that we had refashioned this deal and we were going to back it all the way. But the key to it was we got the Prudential and First National State, which was the big bank then, Beneficial, remember their one company, to buy, I don't know, $50, $75 million of the $300 million plus of bonds we had to sell. And so we were able to refinance it. We cut a better deal with the Giants. There's a remarkable symmetry between that and what Corzine just did, because it was a sweetheart deal for the Giants to get them over here. And then we used that better deal, along with getting a sense of the legislature to pass a bill, pass a sense of the legislature commitment, although it was not a legal commitment to back the bonds, and we used that to convince Wall Street. Rockefeller was blocking it. One of the interesting things about those bonds have to have a paying agent in the Wall Street area, conventionally. No New York bank or branch would be the paying agent for those bonds. Those original bonds had the Bank of Tokyo, New York branch, as the paying agent. I mean, the Rockefellers were so successful. That's why they couldn't be sold, because they locked up the financial community. Then Merrill Lynch finally broke ranks and came in, and we were able to get it done.
Who were the key players in getting that done?
Well, Cliff and I worked on that. That was and Luke Hayden. I mean, it was done during the transition. So we did it, and
Was Sonny Werblin involved in
Oh, well, Sonny Werblin is the father. The sports complex ought to be named after him. Sonny Werblin was the father of the sports complex under Cahill. He a remarkable man. He was deeply disappointed when the first deal fell through, and he set about convincing us that it was worth doing a second deal. God knows why he ever put up with me. I mean, he was this international figure, you know. Chairman of Ronald Reagan's first inaugural. Ronald Reagan's closest friend. He got Ronald Reagan the deal with GE, or whatever that deal was, that bailed him out after his acting career. Didn't work. But he stayed with us, and I think there would be no sports complex if it weren't for Sonny Werblin. But at the time, you know, there was no sports complex but for Brendan Byrne, because you couldn't finance it.
As you take office as treasurer, what are your priorities in running the department? What kind of situation did you walk into?
Well, I have to be honest with you. My first priority was to find a way to ensure that the decisions that were being made in the department were honest. There'd been sufficient trouble so that I was actually a little frightened about taking that job and what might go on that I wouldn't be aware of and that would come back to haunt me. So we were very tough at first. I brought in a small group of people, and we were very tough, probably tougher than we should have been even on the career people.
What was the quality of the staff when you got there?
Well, the first thing I did was fire all the unclassifieds. Actually had their checks delivered to my office and made them come to pick it up. Half of them didn't show, so they really had no-show jobs. They didn't even show up for the checks. And the others, I explained that I couldn't evaluate their performance, but I wasn't going to structure the department that way. And I never did fill most of those jobs.
Now, what were those jobs? Were those political
They were
patronage
political jobs, by and large, I think.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And were some of them truly no-show jobs?
Yeah, half of them, I'd say.
And did those people ever get their checks, the people who didn't come to your office?
No. That was it. We did, right, so we started expanding that program statewide, and we actually got rid of several hundred people. But I set watchdogs at a number of places, and then I also used the career people this way. In the selection of bond managers and bond counsels, I set up a career staff committee to make the choices and took the treasurer out of the process so that there couldn't be any attempt to influence Treasury. We put somebody from the Attorney General's office on to watch it. We made the Attorney General bond counsel. Remember, there was a big breakthrough in those days, very controversial, amusing in retrospect. And so we had all those reforms. The second priority was obviously the budget because of the timing of when you take office. You're stuck with a budget right away.
A deficit? You walked into a deficit
Deficit,
situation?
and we had the school financing thing, and the first year was, was a struggle. The second year we cut the budget. Really cut it, not just proposed a cut. The end result was a cut. I make that distinction. That's probably what helped the income tax get passed more than anything. That and one other thing, which we'll probably come to later in the story.
All right. Well, then let me just ask you, are there any other transition issues or thoughts that are worth committing to posterity?
No, I can only remember one other bend and burn anecdote that's towards the end of the transition when I think he was really sick of me coming to him with things to do. And there was somebody I really thought we should hire, and he wouldn't hire them. And we went back and forth on it, and he finally looked at me and said, "Dick, I don't like his tie, okay? I don't like his tie."
Did he prevail?
Of course. I mean, I don't know what the real reason was, but it was an intense period where you make a lot of decisions, and you have incomplete information. And
did it prepare you to be Corzine's transition director 32 years later?
Oh, I think I was infinitely more prepared than this. I had the disadvantage of not knowing the names and numbers. When I did this for Byrne, because I worked for Hughes and because a bunch of us had been around and because I followed things closely, I knew who everybody was. When I did this for Corzine, I didn't know who anybody in the legislature was. I mean, I couldn't have told you who half the people in office were, let alone the people who should be kept or left. So it was, but on the other hand, there is something about having more experience and more patience. And
there is something to being older and wiser?
yeah, although it's a terrible price to pay for it.